Hey, greetings and welcome to week 4, lecture 2. In the first lecture of this week, we spoke about the 7 deadly sins of leadership. And we started making our way through this list. The first of which we talked about was ego, which shows up in a number of different ways, but basically says that I want to be something that I'm not, or I am something more than I ought to recognize that I am. Or we have impatience. Things don't happen for me at the pace that I believe that they should, so I go out and sort of take control of those things myself. Um, the pace of God is too slow for the work of God, so I must help God along in that process. And then the third one we looked at was this sense of presumption, is that I deserve more than I've been given, and I'm going to make that happen in whatever way I need to. And then the fourth one that we looked at was comparisons and competitiveness. Now, I want to move into the fifth of the 7 deadly sins, and this next one is what we might call impetuousness. Impetuousness is really about those who make rash decisions. If I could use it this way, I would suggest that impetuousness is leadership without the capacity to understand or recognize the consequences to our actions. So it acts first, and then fails to ask the question about what's going to be the result of those actions until after they've happened. Impetuousness feels as though every situation demands its attention right now. It lives reactively and based upon a sense of assumed urgency behind every situation that might come up. It fails to recognize that one, God is at work, and there is a power in the pause, right? Our ability to slow down, take a breath, consider the multiple angles of the many situations that we find ourselves in, and being able to stand in other people's shoes, hear their heart, listen to their whys and what fors instead of just jumping to action and overly asserting ourselves. Jonathan Haidt, who is a psychologist at NYU, talks about the way in which the brain functions, and I think it's a really important designation that he draws for us in this illustration that he uses between the rider and the horse. So he wants to suggest that the rational part of the brain is like the rider, and the emotional or the limbic system of the brain is the elephant. And the rational part of the brain is logical. It makes assessments. It operates at a pace of reflection. It wants to make reasonable decisions based upon future yield. Whereas the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain, the elephant, it's driven by this sense of, of impulse, desire, passion, and what he wants to suggest is that we operate best when the two play well together. Unfortunately, what happens for a lot of us, many of us, in fact, leaders even, is that we allow the limbic system of our brain to set the tone and to control the pace and the reactiveness, and it makes the rider subservient to the elephant. And now some would suggest that's the natural way of humanity, and 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 I want to say that it might be natural for us to operate out of the limbic, but one of the things we learn scripturally is that we are in no way captive to the natural, right? There is this spiritual capacity led by the Spirit of God that stays in step with the Spirit of God, who also has within it the mind of Christ, the capacity for discernment to not allow the limbic system to drive who we are, how we lead, and how we operate. So I want to suggest that perhaps as leaders, to avoid the impetuousness that comes by rash action, that we learn to, in prayer and by the pace of prayer and through the Spirit of God and staying in step with that Spirit, allow the faith-filled rider to begin to again dictate the movement of the elephant, but also recognize that the elephant brings value when it operates out of a intentional, strategic passion that has been run through rational, faithful reflection. And so I think that's important for us to recognize. So we've got ego, impatience, presumption, comparisons, and competition. That we've got impetuousness. The next one I might suggest would be cynicism, and cynicism I think is a deadly sin for leadership, and I watch this creep in all the time, um, uh, where a certain form of contempt begins to settle in towards the organization or the church or the group of people that we're leading, because they just don't get it. They won't fulfill their promises. They won't do what they say they're going to do. And there's betrayals waiting around the corner, and so there's this deep cynicism that just believes that it's not going to work out. So why put much stock or how much hope in where we go from here? And I think we have to guard against that cynicism, because I think it really can lead us down a couple different directions. It can show up in our arrogance, in our constant critique as we stand over and condescend to those who are doing the work. I really think cynicism makes us the grumpy spectator in the stands who wants to call into question everything the players on the field are actually doing. For me, cynics oftentimes are better problem spotters than they are problem solvers, and I just don't have a lot of time for people who are going to live out of that kind of cynicism. Or it leads to this sense of despair. Woe is me, there's no good that could potentially ever come from what it is that we're doing. Or the last one I would say is that cynics become real passive aggressive. They make these little jabs, little comments. They sabotage things by having conversations after the meeting, in which they say to the new person or the person who's still trying to make their way, don't worry, because none of that was talked about and there's actually going to happen anyways, or they're not going to listen to your ideas, or these little passive aggressive moments in which they continue to control the tone and the setting of the organization by their cynicism. And so I think we have to recognize and name cynicism when it begins to emerge. So ego, impatience, presumption, comparison and competitiveness, impetuousness, and cynicism. And the last one that I want to suggest to us in terms of the 7 deadly sins for leadership is impurity. And I know impurity is a difficult category, especially for those of us who have grown up in holiness traditions, because that seems to allude to this sort of legalism or moralism, and that's not really what I'm trying to drive at. Though there could be moments in which we need to recognize that maybe we're allowing some form of sin to creep in that has remained unconfessed. But I want to talk about in terms of impurity of motivation, which is what catalyzes our movement forward. It's the drive, it's the push. And so when our motives are impure, when they're self-seeking, when they're self-serving, when they're driven by agendas that are disconnected from the kingdom of God, those impurities begin to set the tone for the organization, in which those who are passionate for the kingdom will begin to recognize in our motives something that is off. And if you wed impure motives with ego, it can create a real strain within a congregation, in that those voices of faithfulness, those prayerful voices of faithfulness, those ones that might have a word to speak into the selfish ambition and vain conceit, are often snuffed out and driven away. And what happens is the people that end up surrounding the leader are nothing but yes men and yes women. So we have impurity of motivations, which is the drive, or impurity of aspiration, which is the aim, right? What are we directed at? What goal are we setting, and why are we trying to get there? In what purpose does our aspiration serve? Is it something about us, or is it something that is kingdom oriented? And then ultimately, I think purity of heart, right? Purity of heart, and what emerges out of an impure heart, whether it be rash anger, whether it be criticism, a critical spirit for those that work with us in the organization, the impurity of the heart in terms of lies and deceit and breaches of integrity. I think all of those play into the impurity that I think can be a deadly sin for leadership. So we've looked at these seven, right? Ego, impatience, presumptions, comparisons, competitiveness, impetuousness, cynicism, and impurity. And what I want to suggest to us is we need to attend to these seven deadly sins, because if there's anything that's going to sabotage our capacity to lead well and to lead long, it's going to be one of these seven, or a mixture of how these seven begin to flesh out. And what I think we'll find is that oftentimes these seven actually wed together pretty well. And this is why spiritual formation consistently becomes an issue for us, because we've got to have times in which we pause, reflect, slow down, and consider our leadership in light of what we know to be out of sync with the way in which God has called us to lead in this world.